Well, hey there, everybody. So, welcome back to another lecture in this series on the basics of economic regulation. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about product safety regulation, and the theme to this, right, or sort of the overarching takeaway from this is that regulation occurs within a social context. We should recognize that product safety regulation is really only one channel through which changes in product safety occur, right? And indeed, most changes in product safety really aren't the result of regulation, but rather are a result of these other forces. And those include consumer pressure, right? So oftentimes consumers will demand safer or less risky products. And so, of course, producers react, right? And that's sort of how the market is supposed to work, right? People want a thing, or they want to change to a thing, and then producers react to that and alter the product. And that's great, right? That's sort of a reduces costs, right? There's no regulatory burden, sort of what we would hope to see. There are also changes that in the legal environment that have impacted producers' desire to produce safer products, and that has to do with product liability laws and changes to tort liability. The idea that firms can be held responsible legally for damages resulting from failures of their product, right? Means that it is a cost to the business, right? So if a product fails, resulting in damage to somebody's person or potentially property, that the producer may be responsible for those damages, of course, is a cost that then producers are going to be incentivized to offset, right, or to mitigate. Really three channels, right? We have regulatory changes, right? So we're going to regulate certain types of safety. We have the market itself through consumer preferences for more safe products or less dangerous products. And then three, changes in the legal environment through product liability laws. Okay, so this is sort of the sort of sketch that your textbook, if you're taking this course, uses to express sort of all these relationships. And so we see over there on the far side, producer action, right? We see producer action being influenced by these sort of three areas: tort liability, regulation, and consumer decisions, which are the three that we just talked about a moment ago. Now, this is a good time to talk a little bit about tort liability. What is a tort? Okay, this is not a class in legal theory, so I'm sure that there is a YouTube video that discusses torts in a superior way to what I'm going to just say, right? So please understand that I'm an economist. Okay, so torts refer to damages that occur from between individuals, right, or groups of individuals that do not violate the law, okay, but do cause damages to a person or a person's property. So, for example, let's say that your neighbor's tree falls down and it crashes onto your vehicle, your car, or whatever, right? There's no law that's been broken there. Trees are allowed to exist in lawns, and cars are allowed to exist in front of houses. So, nobody necessarily did anything illegal, right? But somebody's got to pay for that, right? And so, does the owner of the property with the tree on it have to compensate the owner of the vehicle, right? So this is a tort, right? And if the owner of the tree is liable, it's a tort liability. So of course you can see clearly that if tort liabilities expand, if the law makes producers more responsible for the operation or for the safe usage of their products, then producers are going to be more likely, all things being equal, to build that safety into the product, even in the total absence of regulation requiring them to do so. Okay, so understanding that there are these sort of host of forces that play into producers' decision to, mitigate risk in their products that they sell. Let's focus in on the regulation of product safety. Over here, okay, so we have the idea of the approval process for pharmaceuticals, right? This is, of course, is very timely for reasons that we're all aware of who are watching this in 2021. But what we have here on the vertical axis is a reduced probability of survival. Okay, so and over here on the horizontal axis we have an increased probability I of survival. And so this ray from the origin at 45 degrees, where R is equal to I, is sort of a break even, right? That's where the reduced probability of survival is sort of equal to the increased probability of survival associated with the development of a pharmaceutical. Now, all areas to the northwest of this function, R equals I, where R is greater than I, gives us the area in which the risk associated with the pharmaceutical outweighs the benefits. Okay. While all areas to the southeast of this function, where R is less than I, are where the risks are less than the benefits. Okay. Now, then we have sketched in here this area R star, I star, all area to the southeast of that, that is current FDA policy, so Food and Drug Administration, which they're responsible for approving these things. We'll notice a few things. One, the I, so where we start here, sorry. So why don't we start at 0, right? Okay, well, what's suggested by this is that there's some level of, so if there's very minimal increased survival, right, then it's not worth any risk, right? So if the benefits of the drug really aren't very significant, that is to say they're less than I star, then no risk is acceptable. And once we get to I star and past it, right, then some level of risk is acceptable, but we'll note that R star here is far, far less than the break-even point for any benefit. The likely benefit has to be significantly greater than the risks associated with it. This might mean that for every 1,000 people the drug saves, there's only maybe one person who is somehow damaged or loss of life associated with the drug, right? So that the benefits far, far outweigh the potential risks. These sort of processes for product safety, right? That if we're going to regulate something this way, we generally have to err way on the side of caution, because that's sort of how society works, and that's what's expected. So, if we understand that maybe if we require people to wear seat belts, that there's one person in 10,000 who is actually harmed by wearing that seat belt, but there's a couple thousand that are saved as a result of wearing the seat belt, then we regulate it. But if it was 1-to-1, right, then we wouldn't regulate that. Okay, that leads us to these ideas of type 1 and type 2 errors. Now, these terms, right, type 1 and 2 errors are used in scientific processes, right? So it's not just economics. You would find this in any of the sciences, as well as the social sciences like economics. So when we refer to type 1 errors, these are times where, in this case, in this application with drug approvals, the drug is safe and effective, but we reject it, right? So that was the sort of wrong choice. More generally, this is where a thing is true, a hypothesis is true, but we reject it for whatever error in our work. Okay, so this is known as a type 1 error. A type 2 error in this application is when the drug is not safe and effective, right? So it's neither safe nor effective, and we approve it, right? And so this, in sort of more general scientific language, would be where our hypothesis is false and we accept it anyway. Okay, and we can see obviously that the other two quadrants are the correct decision. It's safe and effective, we approve it. It's not safe and effective, we don't approve it, right? So those can be sort of dismissed. As regulators, we are generally more concerned about type 2 errors, because again, that's sort of how society works. But we should be aware that there would be a social response from type 1 errors too. So if the drug is safe and effective and we reject it, or we don't let people use it, right? There are going to be some who are going to recognize that lives could have been saved if we had approved this more quickly, and we should expect that there would be that type of reaction. Okay, furthering this discussion about this sort of approval process, and then these sort of type 1 and type 2 errors, we can sort of incorporate all those ideas, all those things, all those potential problems or failings into this sort of understanding, right? And so what we see here, that's three functions. The first function here, these are the expected health costs from use of a drug that is not safe and effective. Okay, so we notice that if there's very little pre-market testing, that is to say we're way down here, so we sort of get the drug out there right away, right? And we don't test it, right? There's going to be a lot of problems and a lot of accidents and a lot of health costs, right, and potentially loss of life. The more testing that we do, that's going to fall, right? So this function is going to decline. This function here, these are the costs to gain approval and costs of delay. So introducing a safe and effective drug, right? So if we sort of just approved, right, every drug that came out the moment it came out, right, then there would be very little costs there. But of course, the longer the process of approval takes, right, the more explicit costs that the producer bears, but then the more people who get sick and potentially have serious health issues because the drug has not yet been approved, is an additional cost to society, right? So this function increases, right? So this is sort of the trade-offs associated with seeking to avoid both potential type 1 and type 2 errors, right? Okay, and of course, if we sum the vertical height of these two functions, then we get something that looks like this. Okay, and what is that total cost? It is an expression of those trade-offs of attempting to mitigate or potentially even eliminate type 1 and type 2 errors. And from that we get, economists love these sort of optimalities, right? And so we get this optimality of T star. Now, in reality, are you likely to know exactly T star? No, but you can estimate it, right? And from looking at a lot of processes that have occurred in the past, you can start to get some idea of whether you're to the right or to the left of where that T star likely is. In other words, if you're to the right of that, you're imposing too much cost on the industry and society with this approval process, given the likely damages, right? And if you're to the left of it, you're doing the reverse. You're taking too many risks, right? You're rushing this through. You're trying to get it done too quickly, and it's likely that you're going to have serious negative side effects associated with this. And so it's an illustration of this idea that there is a sort of right way to go about doing this, or at least a right-ish way of going about doing this. And there is a trade-off between sort of rushing things and moving fast and dragging your feet and going too slow on these. And by the way, that would apply for a lot of things, right? Not just product safety, but it's a lot of stuff in society and economy that would apply to. All right, now the second thing we want to consider, so we've talked a little bit about timeliness, we've talked a little bit about the political process associated with product safety, right? The next thing we kind of want to talk about is consumer reaction to product safety. And so the example we're going to talk a little bit about here is sort of seatbelt usage. When I was a kid, I can remember, so in the 1970s, right, wearing seatbelts was actually pretty rare. Um, I don't know if my father ever wore a seatbelt in his life. um, and but of course today, right, it's universal. Like virtually nobody doesn't wear a seatbelt in the car. In fact, most modern cars won't even. I mean, if you try to drive around without a seatbelt on, it won't stop bothering you. It'll make all kinds of noises, crazy stuff, right? So it's pretty universal, and of course, the roads are a lot safer these days than they were back then, partially as a result of that. But of course, we should recognize that anytime you increase product safety, there's always the likelihood that people take additional risks, right, and thus offset that product safety. So, for example, if people wearing seatbelts universally causes them to drive faster because they feel they've mitigated some of the risk of driving, then they in turn are mitigating some of the benefits of the safety belts themselves, because driving faster, all things being equal, increases your likelihood of being injured or killed in a car accident. Okay, now that may seem strange, like you're thinking like, well, I don't know if I drive faster because I wear a safety belt. Yeah, probably you didn't think about that, but if you apply the reverse reasoning, which is the same thing, right, you can see you almost certainly do that. So when the street is risky, that is to say it's perceived as more risky to drive on it, do you drive slower? I'll bet you do, right? I mean, if you don't live in a cold climate like I do, if the I can remember when I lived in the desert, right? If there's a sandstorm, you slow down, right? Because you can't see very well ahead of you. And that's the exact same reasoning, right? So if people perceive a change in risk, do they adjust their behavior? And the answer is very likely. Very likely they do, right? So then how much? Okay, so here we see sort of an economist's graphical representation of this idea. Okay, so let's say we require safety belts, right? So everybody's got to wear their seatbelt. Maybe this is before regulation. This is probability of death to the driver, and this is their driving intensity, or how reckless they're driving, right? Okay, yeah, driving intensity, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Are they driving fast? Are they being reckless as they're driving? It's better. Be a better label here. And so we've got a relationship here, pre-regulation, right? So the more reckless you drive, the more likely you are to be hurt. Okay, and then we mandate safety belts, and so you can drive faster, and you're less likely to be hurt because in a collision you're going to be retained with inside the central portion of the car where it's relatively safe. We can get sort of this initial point, like if we take some level of driving intensity, if they have people don't wear their safety belts are kind of here, and then if they do, they're here, right? And so we've significantly reduced the probability of death to the driver for any given level of driving intensity. But of course, if people start driving faster and more recklessly, we may move from a point like point B to point C. And we can see then that if we move this over to the left, we read off the y-axis, we can see that about half of the mitigation due to the regulation in this case has has been eliminated, right? And of course, if people were even adapted their behavior even more, right, it's potentially possible, right, if they were way out here, right, they could more than offset the change in driver safety here through changes in behavior. So understanding how consumers are likely to react to regulation in terms of their personal behavior is obviously extremely important, because if we create a regulation that alters behavior so much that it makes people take much risky behavior, well, then we were probably better off before we even regulated it in the first place. Again, sort of following through on this, sort of here's like, okay, why would they do that, right? Well, here's your marginal costs and here's your marginal benefits, pre-regulation, post-regulation, right? So this is how slow you drive, right? If before you didn't have safety belts, if you slowed down, you got a big benefit, like maybe you don't die, right? Once you have the safety belts, if you slow down, you just go slower, right? You're no more safe. I'm kind of laughing because it's kind of a silly example. It's probably not something I should be laughing about, but I think you understand why I am where I am. Okay. So beyond changes in individual behavior, we should also recognize the possibility of this so-called lulling effect. Okay, to lull somebody is to sort of move them into a state of unawareness or lack of awareness. So we would say, something like, well, we would lull a baby to sleep, right? So maybe you'll sing them a nice quiet song and the baby's all worked up, right? And you sing them a nice quiet song and then they sort of fall asleep. This is lulling. Okay. So there's also this possibility that if consumers perceive a safer environment, that they'll stop paying attention to things. I ride motorcycles a lot, right? And I particularly like old motorcycles, which are extremely hands-on. You sort of have to be paying attention to everything all the time, not just externally, but with the vehicle itself. And certainly, I see plenty of people every day driving cars that they're on their cell phone, they're talking, they're doing both, they're putting makeup on, they're eating a burger, you name it, because modern cars some cars do everything for you, right? They're self-driving, but most cars do most things for you nowadays. And so do people stop paying attention to the world around them? Because of course if they stop paying attention, that's going to mitigate the safety regulations as well, right? Or just the safety regulations that the market has built into the product. And that's that's obviously a serious issue. The example here is sort of child safety caps. Maybe people they just leave the cap off, right? Because they can't open the child safety. Well, and obviously doesn't do any good, right? Doesn't do any good. This child safety cap only works if it's put on and engaged properly. So I actually have a lot of strong opinions about this, but I'm going to hold my tongue in an effort to keep these videos relatively short. Suffice it to say that certainly it's my personal observation that this is actually much more significant than changes in behavior of people being more reckless as a result of this. It's to stop paying attention. Okay, so then let's move on to thinking a little bit about product liability. There are different standards of product liability that we should at least be aware of. The first is a negligence standard, so that's up on the top over there, and you can read what that says, right? This is very common. So the regulation will be written that the producer has sort of a negligence standard. So if the producer is negligent, then they're then they're in violation. You could have a strict liability standard, which is over here, and those are different things, right? So strict liability is no matter what I do, right, however I use it, the producer is liable. Whereas the negligence standard would be if the product somehow fails in some way due to sort of a failure to meet minimum standards. So if I'm driving a car and the wheel falls off, and I've not touched it, right? So if I took the wheel off and put it on wrong, right, then that's different. But if I have a brand new car and I drive off the lot and a wheel falls off and I'm hurt, right, that's negligence. Where strict liability would be a little more severe, well, significantly more severe than that. And there are degrees of strict liability here too. The definition here touches on it about absolute liability as well as strict liability. Okay, just in wrapping up here, I want to touch on this slide here a little bit, and this bottom line here. In reality, in modern developed countries, the truth is that the government is always the final manager of risk. Okay, and we may have moral problems with that or philosophical problems with that being the case. So insert nanny state comments here, but that's sort of the truth, right? When all else fails, we all sort of look to the government to figure out how we're going to mitigate that. And some people are going to go to domestic problems, like of course the pandemic that we're dealing with right now. The government, we look to the government to mitigate these, but it needn't be so, right? Of course, there's risk of foreign invasion as well, and so of course we go to the government, right, for that. And so sort of risk in general, the state and the government is effectively the final manager of that risk for any given society. Okay, so it's important to recognize that. All right, that's quite enough for this time. I think maybe we've gone on too long, so we'll leave it there, and we'll see you again next time. I hope you're enjoying these, and take care, everybody.